On behalf of WFEB TLEX Institute, I just wanted to welcome everyone. And I'd like to start with just acknowledging the thoughtful remarks from the opening panel this morning, the keynote panel. It's such an amazing time of challenge and also hope. And I'm very excited to bring this breakout panel together. The Great COVID Reset. And how do we build back with greater resilience, connection, and empathy and equity? So just wanted to start with a few opening remarks. Then I'll introduce the panelists, and then we should get into a great discussion. Very, very excited. So first, I'd like to start by thanking all of our global partners. This has been a global collaboration, and yeah, it's such an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you today, all of the people live streaming, and all of the people who are participating in the Global Symposium. And I'd like to just start by setting some context, which all of us know, but is sometimes hard to put in perspective. So I love the idea of a metaphor with this. And COVID has been, in a way, like a huge tidal wave. For many of us, we've felt the ground moving out from under us, the way we work, the way we live, the way we take care of our families, the way communities interact with each other. So as that ground is pulling out, there's also a whole accelerant of trends coming toward us. An acceleration toward digital commerce away from say, local commerce, a deep exposure to inequities in our systems, in our structures, particularly here in the United States. And while COVID hasn't been all bad, I know many people have spent more time with their families than they have in years in many cases. We can't deny that there have been massive challenges, and it's come at a massive cost. And one of those things, at least here in the United States, which is top of mind, is just access and to services, to human services, and to healthcare, and many of the deep inequities that we have in our country around that. The disproportionate burden on women and mothers who are often juggling home and work has come at a massive cost. And the unhealthy coping mechanisms that many have faced as they have been trying to cope with the social isolation of the pandemic, which was already an underlying trend around mental health and many things around addiction. And these are just some of the many challenges that we've been facing. But for this session, I bring a lot of hope and I'm very excited about the panel that has come together here, because I feel like each of them has such unique insights into what a reset could look like, and also brings great lived experience to this point and tacit knowledge that they can share with all of you. And we very intentionally have created cross-disciplinary panels. So I'll share more about each of the panelists, but we have deep expertise in community work and policy. We have a technologist, business person who's building out future solutions. And we have an advisor executive who is advising many of the fast accelerating tech companies that will shape the world that we live in. So with that, I will go to the panel introductions, and I'll start with April Walker. So April Walker is a senior director at overseeing 15 Centers for Excellence Technology Labs at Microsoft. She's also a graduate of the Sloan School of Business, and she shares a passion for both business transformation, but also community and civic engagement. And April, welcome to the panel. So nice to have you. The next person I'll introduce is Johan Yuvin. Johan is a founder and advisor of his principal advising services, but he's also a two-term former acting Secretary of Education under President Obama, and has been a former delegate to a number of different organizations, including the OED and numerous other things, including being a PhD from Harvard Kennedy School. And last, I'd like to introduce Madhu Muju, who has 20 years experience in 20 plus years experience in management consulting, executive roles, is a volunteer who's very committed to community resilience, and also serves as a mentor to many, and is advising leaders who are really building the future now in fast growing, accelerating companies. And so with that, I think we can go into the panel view, and we'll go ahead and get started. So the first question I'd like to start with is, so often we're looking forward into the future around what are the trends that are coming, what are the shiny objects that we can pursue, or the new innovations and technologies. But I thought for starting this panel, I would start with really taking in the moment, just having a pause around what we've been through and also where we are right now. So I thought I would start with you, April, if you could share some of your remarks with us.
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about this past year, and candidly, we are still in it, right? We haven't turned the corner yet completely. I am always reminded of what I call the imperfect storm, because it really was. I can't call it a perfect storm because that implies something good. We've come through such an unnerving time where, as you spoke about earlier, Johan, the world and the earth beneath us has shifted. We had, I think, a combination of pandemics. We had the virus, obviously, but we've also had social unrest. We've had, more concentration and visibility in terms of inequities and racial, not just social, but racial unrest, lack of accessibility to resources, inequities in pay, and healthcare. So, when I think about what that future looks like, or what I'm most hopeful about is, and you and I have spoken about this before, my sincerest hope in being hopeful is that we don't forget. We don't forget what we've come through. We have a tendency to have very short recall and memory. When things are bad, we really, pull up our sleeves and do the work. The moment it gets good again, or the world becomes better again, we tend to forget what we've gone through, and we will then repeat the past, and we don't want to do that. So I'm most hopeful that these painful lessons that we've learned, that we're going to look at the future and think and be more mindful and intentional about how we avoid them in the future. That's what I'm most hopeful for. Hopefully that was your question.
Oh, thank you so much for those remarks. Madhu, how about from your point of view, as we take in this moment, what are some of the salient patterns or motifs that you're sort of seeing?
That's a great question. And just building on what April said, we've been through a very unprecedented time. I don't remember using the term unprecedented as much as I used it over last 13 months. And these times have tested us, right, at every level, be it personal or professional. And as I look at from a very professional centric perspective, I do feel that there is a need for connection. Corporates are looking at engaging with their stakeholders, and stakeholders, i.e., is your employee base, is your customer, is your shareholder. And digitization has really taken over. The personal connections have been taken over by digital, and we are seeing a huge acceleration on that. I mean, as we look at workforce, there is a need to really redefine what the future of work is, and there is a lot of dialogue around it. And when we talk about future of work, there is definitely a zoom in into some of the inequalities that we saw not just in the corporate world, but also in the social setting. And April beautifully touched on, be it accessibility, be it racial inequality, be it pay inequality, those are becoming trends for corporates to solve. So one of the things that we are going to see as we move forward is really corporate America leaning into and really helping redefine what that policy looks like, because it's impacting business, it's impacting the well-being of our economy. That's the biggest trend that I'm seeing, Johan. And it's exciting and it's very hopeful.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Madhu. Johan?
Well, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. But before I speak to this question, I want to thank Johan and my fellow panelists, April and Madhu, for this opportunity to be part of what I think is a critical dialogue. And I feel truly humbled to be in your presence. But when I when I think about the last 12 to 18 months, I mean, it's so clear that these months have been unlike any times in recent history, and in so many ways have disrupted our lives and sadly and often brought enormous loss and grief to too many families. When you think about it, the way we act and behave, the way we interact, the way we work together, the way we play, the availability and convenience of goods and services on demand, all of this actually has changed, and I believe likely changed for many years to come. So when I think about the future, so yeah, it most certainly remains uncertain, and it's clear to me, particularly when we think about the world of work, that the health pandemic and its economic twin of pervasive automation have really accelerated innovation across all fields and sectors and borders and boundaries between nations. While they may have been physically closed, they have opened up, and it seems like the world has learned how to come together to collaborate on finding therapeutics and vaccination solutions and ways to sustain our economy under new constraints of this reality. So for me, I think what Bill and Melinda Gates, in their most recent annual letter called "We're all in this together," that sort of "we're all in this together" attitude gives me great hope, not just in terms of where we are going as it pertains to global collaboration, but to ensure that we can not only contain this virus, but also extend this type of collaboration that has emerged to other areas of our work, not just health. Why not think about that type of global cooperation and collaboration around other significant issues, whether that's creating economic mobility and achieving greater social justice.
Thank you so much, Johan. I think about you guys' opening remarks. A single word comes to me, which is contact. Contact with our employee bases, contact with those interdependencies and complexities that you were talking about, in contact with the communities that so often we don't interact with, and the true challenges of this have really, as you said so aptly, April, brought us together, jarred our memory to maybe work together, and the importance of that contact has built empathy and connection toward that. Just going out of this phase, I know that self-awareness is so powerful in intentional design of coming out of something. And so I would just be curious from each of your purviews, what are some of the adaptive challenges or adaptive opportunities, if framed another way, that you think are important for us to kind of have in mind as we think before we sort of jump into what's next?
That to me, I believe it is. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting when I think about the adaptive challenges. I want to kind of go back to what you said in terms of empathy and self-awareness. I think what we're going to see is more adaptive leadership, particularly in the cases of the corporate space, right? There's a lot of conversation now about intentionality, empathy, vulnerability, having that focus, if you will, on the connection. Madhu talked about the connection between people. And I think, at the backdrop of all of that, particularly in the corporate space, we have to think about all of the things that we can do as leaders, or the leaders that lead these organizations, lead these companies that are put in positions of power. This adaptive leadership, to me, means that we're going to be navigating new waters. And these new waters are, how do we transition from being disconnected, if you will? We certainly have been a bit more disconnected in terms of the human touch, but how do we become more adaptive leaders? How do we ensure that we create safe spaces for our employees or those within our remit to feel what they are going to feel? This has been a daunting time, but when I think about how do we adapt as leaders, how do we become more vulnerable as leaders? How do we demonstrate that? And that's on sort of like the human element side of it. But then there's also the notion of adapting to certain types of innovation. All of our industries, this pandemic has not discriminated in its impact and effect on industries. And when we think about, for example, telehealth, how we shop, how we, manage our ability to do little things such as renewing a license or things of those things, things of that nature. So adaptiveness to me is going to cross so many different paradigms, adaptive leadership being one, but also adaptiveness in our technological and innovative solutions. I work with customers every single day, helping them to devise solutions that allow them to maintain their productivity, maintain connection, if you will, amongst their employees. So the adaptiveness, I think, is going to take a multi-pronged approach, if you will, both from the leadership standpoint, but also how we infuse the technology to make that connection possible.
Thank you so much for that, April. Madhu, maybe I'll just riff to you off of that. And how do we, in particular, is there any thoughts that you have around how we balance this human connection and the technological connection?
I think that's a great question, Johan, and I would say a multi-billion-dollar question that we as enterprises are trying to solve. I mean, I really think that we need to go to basics, and that's the only way forward. And last year was a ground zero. We all, as human race, were at ground zero. So, why not take things in a very simplistic manner and break them? And from a simplistic manner, I would say that we have to lead with empathy. And what does that mean? That means that every innovation, every policy, every business process that we are looking at, we have to bring in human centricity in it. And once that happens, mindfulness, intentional, adaptive leadership is going to emerge. I really think that's really the demand of the time right now.
Johan, I just building off of that, I know so much of policy is around planning and adapting is emergent often. And I would be curious your thoughts with decades of policy experience and any other reflections that you have.
Sure. As I was thinking about this question, I really saw like three levels of adaptive challenges. One is sort of at the personal, individual level. Then one is at the interpersonal level. And then the third level is really at the policy level, and there's clear connections and challenges there with the business sector, with the education and training sectors, and so forth. So if it's okay, I'll want to say just a few words about those three levels. So starting with the individual level and on a personal level, I think that the energy and perspective that we gain when we have in-person interactions is most certainly or has most certainly been an adaptive challenge for me during the pandemic. And I know from speaking with my loved ones that I'm not the only one who has experienced that. And I think that need for connection has been and will remain an adaptive challenge for many of us at the individual level, at least for the foreseeable future. That said, for all of us, I think, is how do we take on this challenge of creating, maintaining, and sustaining a well-balanced sort of life with meaningful work opportunities and adequate time for non-working relationships and activities. And I think our opportunity in this moment is to think of ways to redesign our world of work so that, as Johan and Uma from the Institute have often said, that it acknowledges each individual holistically and demonstrates and acts on empathy and compassion to ensure not just ourselves, but our peers are supported, included, respected, and treated with dignity, irrespective of the role, function, or level of leadership or responsibility that we have. Now, when I think about adaptive challenges beyond the individual and interpersonal levels, many of them relate to the impact of technological advancements and related automation on our businesses, our institutions, and our government and policy entities, and most importantly, our workers themselves. Because it's clear to me that our businesses are trying to find ways to integrate and optimize the application of all these advancements, but there are some adoption and adaptation challenges. And in some cases, business capacity stretches, I would call them, to be able to optimize that integration. But when I think about our education and training institutions, they really face the challenge of rethinking how to provide meaningful skill development opportunities. And they will have to rethink pedagogy and content to ensure relevance of the skills that their graduates have. I think our workers will need opportunities to become truly digitally proficient and to strengthen their ability to adapt quickly. And they're going to have very strong knowing how to learn skills, because there will be no time to sort of leave the job, go away for a year and develop some skills and then come back. And then lastly, for our public policies and government agencies, they need to make up for the enormous lag in their response to the exponential rate of technological advancements. And they have to be mindful that the goal should be to find and to create or find meaningful employment for everyone. And that can be only achieved if we finally acknowledge that, yes, we have to make investments, significant investments in infrastructure. Yes, we have to increase our investments in education, particularly our community colleges, workforce development. And I'm not afraid to say, yes, we have to expand our safety net investments, because so many individuals are going to go through difficult transition periods. And yes, I'm not hesitating when I say we have to recalibrate our tax codes and policies to make all of this possible.
Thank you, Johan. Just to piggyback off of that, maybe a question to the other panelists. I'm curious if you have any thoughts, April. Maybe you want to kick in here just around pathways for people. We live in a time of accelerated inequality, which is a major motif. April, Madhu, do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Johan, he brought up a really interesting and compelling point, and that is around the education piece. When I spoke earlier about, we've had multiple pandemics, if you will. Again, obviously the virus, the COVID-19, and now new variants of that. We've had what I think is the pandemic of racial and social inequality. But what I also think about in terms of education is the lack of access This past year hasn't revealed something or things that we didn't know. It's heightened and put more visibility on them. And when I think about pathways, and hopefully I'm gonna, provide a bit of a lens of the pathway I'm thinking about. When I think about a pathway out of this or some of this, particularly in the space of education, it's digital skilling. It's making sure that we are educating a populace that has for far too long been ignored. And that's underrepresented communities. That is brown and Black people who have been for far too long been on the lower end of receiving the types of education and skilling that is so key and so paramount and critical for our collective future. When I think about AI, artificial intelligence, automation, all of those great emerging technologies, predictive analytics, data science, all of these types of things are going to be that paradigm shift that's going to help to propel us to a space where things like what we just went through, or that we're still going through, sure, they may happen again, but we will be better prepared because we will have a community, a collective community that is well equipped with the skills to address it. I think that when I look at my very fortunate educational experience, I went to wonderful schools. I started out at Howard University in Washington, D.C. I then transferred to University of Maryland and got a bachelor's. I went to George Washington University and got a master's in engineering, and then went to MIT Sloan School and got an MBA. I've been very fortunate in that. Not everyone is afforded those opportunities. And I've been an engineer for most of my career, my 33-year career. And when I think about the communities of color, underrepresented communities, all I see is opportunity. That's all I see is opportunity, a massive amount of opportunities for our global world. Think about, when Johan talks about, this and Madhu talk about this connection. If there's one thing we should have learned, or we continue to learn from this, is that this virus, if you will, has connected all of us with one purpose. And that was to get vaccinated, to get rid of this thing, right? So we've had this sort of Independence Day. Some of us remember that movie when we all had to come together as one. And this pandemic has, I think, heightened so many parts of our societal changes. And when I think about one critical pathway out of this, and that is to educate our communities that have for far too long been ignored, or have received, I say, less than sufficient. I think, we can all agree to that. And we have a populace now that's not ready for the digital age. We're not prepared. Technology is not new, and it's here to stay. So for anyone that's misguided and thinking that it's going away, it's not. Having those skills around the emerging technologies that will change the way we reach one another, connect with one another, cure one another, heal our communities, how we, my goodness, even things in terms of how we change the industries in which we all work, manufacturing. I was reading an article the other day where it spoke about the new sort of world order is in the warehouse, right? We're doing a lot more of the warehousing. The way we do our daily lives, conduct our daily lives, is fundamentally going to be driven by a lot of what we put into place for technology advancement. And we need the right skills. We need to ensure that we are equipping our communities with these skills so that we can propel and continue to grow as a society.
Agreed.
Thank you so much, Ava. Those powerful remarks. Madhu, maybe we can, I think that was a really nice landscape from the emergent challenges in creating pathways. But I'm thinking back on one of our conversations just around, everyone's looking to leadership right now. Everyone's looking to the C-suite for all the answers about social unrest and inequalities, around when are we coming back to work, around, what do all these changes mean for me, right? That create a lot of fear in people. And I'd be curious from your point of view, what are the skills and capacities that you're really seeing are needed as we adapt into really a whole new paradigm that leaders have found themselves in?
That's a great question, Johan. Talk about leadership test, and and we saw it in last 13 months, all the more. At this point in time, as we reflect back on what we have witnessed, I really think that the leadership style has completely, the new leadership style has emerged, and Microsoft is a perfect example of it. At this point in time, we need leaders that have, that are as much as a visionary, right? As much as they are a servant leader, they need to know how to serve from behind. We need leaders that are present, and that are really, that are showing up to listen, that are showing up with complete empathy, and that are authentic, that have the capacity to be vulnerable in front of their stakeholders. That's a huge challenge to put forward in front of corporate America, because that wasn't the mold of leadership that corporate America saw. That wasn't the mold of leadership that was awarded. So this is going to be a new wave of leadership that we would have to really groom, that we would have to really provide a support system to really come up. It will be really interesting. And April, I'm looking at you. Microsoft is a perfect example. You guys really turned the, this big Titanic called Microsoft around by the servant leadership. Satya is really a living example of what that leadership can really mean. So that's really what we are seeing. As I'm interacting with the CEOs, as I'm sitting in the boardrooms, that's what is being asked of. This was a changing trend over last 3 to 4 years, but over the pandemic, it's front and center, and you cannot ignore it. It's really, this is a survival skill that's needed at this point in time in the CEO suite.
And let me just, and if you don't mind, Johan, I just want to sort of piggyback off of what Madhu said. I could not agree more. I'm certainly proud and very biased because I work for Microsoft, but we do have an incredible leader, and I'm going to make that plural. We have incredible leaders, but it certainly starts at the top. And I will add to that, I don't think it's fair, if you will, to rely solely on the corporate space to solve the world's ails, right? I think what we need to make sure is that we don't forget that we are a collective village. This is a global pandemic and a global problem and a global set of problems. And I would hope, and I know that we have created these spaces for vulnerability. As Madhu said, this has not been the norm. I've been in the corporate world for over 30 years. And, it was a challenge to be your authentic self or show that vulnerability and empathy. But I don't think it should be something that is relegated to just in that corporate space. We have to do more in the communities in which we serve and reside, right? We have to make sure that in the space that we occupy, whether you are in the federal space, the civic space, the corporate space, that your outreach is not relegated to the borders in which you have within your remit, right? It has to extend to those customers, to those communities, to those villages, if you will, that you create that safe space, that you create the opportunities, that you recognize and you acknowledge the inequities, and that you first, starting with you, and it could be, any CEO, if you will, or any president of an NGO, or whatever the case may be. What are you doing? What are you living in that space? Are you embodying the spirit of that? Because it does start at the top. So Madhu, thank you for the call out of my CEO, but it certainly is something that I'm happy to see, at least within my company, that it's across the board. That servant leadership, our mission our mission statement at the company is that we empower every person on the planet and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And we live by that. But that is not relegated, obviously, to Microsoft. There are many companies and many organizations that in this past year have really, stepped up their game to make change. We just have to make sure that we don't make that change in earnest, and that we do that across the globe, and that we work together to do that. Because again, it can't just be a one-stop shop, right? It can't just be we rely on our governments to fix all of our issues. We can't rely on just corporate America to solve all of our issues. We have to do this collectively.
And Johan, if I may just add one thing that April said, as she said, it's a global village, and if there is one thing that we learned during the pandemic, it's the power of the tribe. And as I'm looking at April, I look at Microsoft, I look at KPMG, and I look at many other organizations where that tribe has really emerged, and that tribe is really partnering very actively with the policymakers, with the NGOs, to really drive that change and bring up that servant leadership to create a long-lasting impact. April, in her opening statement said that, our memories really, they leave us very fast as the times go, as we go to the brighter moments and as we go to the happier times. I think with the leadership with the tribe that we are creating, our memories are going to be staying, our learnings would be deeper, and we would be really creating a path that's full of hope and that's full of change.
If I could just maybe build a little bit on the, first of all, acknowledge, the criticality of the points that my peer panelists have made here around this issue. But when I think about sort of a new level of shared awareness that the pandemic has taught us, which is, I understand that my behaviors and my actions can affect your health outcomes and vice versa. And that if we both share that awareness and act on it, then our community outcomes will be better. That whole idea, I think, is transferable to other issues. So, for instance, and then it becomes a distributed responsibility, right? Not just corporate Americas or the labor unions or the government, or no. It actually then means that your economic opportunity and mobility is affected by my behaviors and actions in that space, and vice versa, right? And if we honor what we learned is possible during the pandemic, it actually leads to better outcomes beyond the individual, actually at the community level. So there is something there, that I think we can optimize and apply it to many different areas. So just wanted to add that.
Can I just say, I could not agree more. I think that is an elegant and eloquent way of putting that. And I have to, the picture that is behind you, without getting too political on your calendar there. But when I think about the notion around policy and servant leadership, and again, what you speak about is so true, Johan, because, it's a domino effect, right? What we do affects what we individually do, or what we do for ourselves in effect will also affect and impact others around us. That's just the way that it works, right? That's just a universal connection. So if we can make sure that the steps and the things that our actions are positive actions for change. And you spoke about, I think the word you used was transitional, and I'm going to say, I'll add to that, it's transformational. Right? It's transformational. The things that we do in our communities, in our companies, in our spaces that we occupy, we affect and impact others around us, and we can do so in a transformational way. We have that opportunity now to do it.
That's very well said. And if I may just add to what my fellow panelists said, I think the time has forced us to really become self-aware. I mean, the beautiful example that Johan you gave was my actions would impact my the folks that I interact with. Their social economical status
Mhm.
on daily basis, and that's huge. That really forces me to be self-aware, and what a blessing. I mean, as much as this has been extremely painful, but this has also given us an opportunity to really introspect and take accountability that uh, you know that we never had to. So I mean, I really, that's the hope, right? The change has started with us, and that's the reason to be more hopeful.
Mm. What's coming to mind as I'm hearing you guys riff on this topic very eloquently is just this role of interconnectivity and cause and effect. Cause and effect whenever we make choices, whenever we take small responsibilities, whenever we choose to care and engage and take those actions beyond ourselves, what a ripple effect that can have when that is distributed across our company cultures, but also across society as a whole. And so just building off of that, um, when there isn't vision, often there's fear. And this comes up so much in the future of work, which all of you have touched on from your own purviews. And I would be curious from your point of view, and maybe Johan, we can start with you here. I know you've been in big institutions, very large institutions, trying to do major reforms, but from an intrinsic, from a personal point of view, what are you most hopeful and inspired about as we build out of this reset that COVID has been?
Um, I think the fact that we are presented right now, and not just in the US, anywhere in the world, with a choice. We're in a choice moment. And depending on what decisions we make about that choice moment, the long-term consequences can differ greatly for all of us everywhere in the world. And for me, the choice is, are we going to continue to operate the way we did pre-pandemic with all of the big issues, systemic, institutional racism, intentional exclusion, and so forth? Or are we going to leverage this moment in time, and particularly this, I call it the rare shared global awareness, to rethink our businesses, our systems, our policies, and our practices so that they actually would be more equitable and reduce the enormous disparities and inequalities in all kinds of areas and domains that we see right now, whether that's in terms of earnings or health or education. Because for me, one of the big lessons, from the pandemic is, and I think April talked about this before, is that it has exacerbated all these disparities that we actually knew existed in health, digital capability, education, economic opportunity, earnings, employment. And it actually amplified these adverse effects on communities of color and low-income youth and adults. Just people don't realize this, but since the beginning of the pandemic, the number of young people in the US under age 25 that were not in school, not in training, and not in a job has more than doubled. It is now at 10.1 million in just 10 to 12 months, setting us back and neutralizing all the enormous progress that we had actually made. So for me, top of mind is making equity the central design principle, and not just doing it as a buzzword, but really making it like a an economic, social, and moral imperative. And when I think about all the things we want to design in this reset moment, I think we have to ask ourselves this question: how might we do this in a way that will result in greater equity and ultimately greater equality in outcomes? If we ask ourselves that question when we are about to make corporate investments in a new product line or service, when we design a new workforce development statute, when we participate in our community and in our churches, if we ask ourselves that question, if we make equity sort of the central value and design principle, I think we can undo many of the opportunity constraints, often intentionally, that were present in our systems pre-pandemic. I think we are in this choice moment, and it's up to us. It's up to us whether we make that choice or not. I know what choice I'm making.
Can I add a fourth one to that? Because I
Yes.
think that was beautifully stated in terms of intentionality. What do you go in with in your intention? To add a fourth one to that, it's also about our political process and our political policies, particularly those around voting. You know, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but when your thoughts are so clear and so relevant, that at the forefront of our decision making should be equity and equitable treatment.
Yes.
And we have to include in that voting opportunity, voting access, equal opportunity. Every American should be able to enforce / select and elect those that they want to have represent them without constraint.
Yeah, we shouldn't have to move a major sports event because a state doesn't have equal voting rights. That is just, I thought we were the United States of America. I guess not.
Madhu, would you like to go next? Just around a vision that you're taking out of this moment?
Johan really described it at a macro and a micro level. And as I take that construct and, what April added on, just taking that construct and saying, and really applying it in terms of practicality. For me, what does it really mean? And how do I make the needle move? And one intention that I'm taking with me is transparency. How do I make sure that I am providing transparency? I'm enabling transparency so that there is visibility into whether our system, whether our corporates, whether our policies, whether our businesses are really enabling that equality, are enabling inclusiveness, are enabling diversity. And that's the theme I'm living by.
Thank you so much. And April, so much of what you're doing right now is building the future today in the choices that you guys are making. I would love to hear from you, your remarks on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, and a significant part of my job is to help organizations, whether it's commercial or regulated industries or within the federal space, with digital transformation. And transformation, to me, is not relegated again to just that digital footprint or how you automate or how you use emerging technologies, and much of what Madhu spoke about as well as my fellow panelist, Johan, it's also about, and I love the notion around transparency. But what I will also add to this, the digital age, if you will, has been, or the digital transformation journey has been really challenging for many companies. And this past year has accelerated the need to sort of dust off some of those digital transformation plan of actions and strategies, and in some cases pivot on things that you thought would work pre-pandemic would no longer, exist, or I should say apply now. But when I think about not just in addition to the transparency, I should say, it's also priority. What are you prioritizing? On a personal level, it has been, I think, very revealing, particularly in this space of remote work, and where this merge of home life and work life have just become one, and you can't separate. It's not a natural separation. Time that I've spent with my family has been amplified, to use that word, and not that it had been something that I wasn't doing before, but there's more intentionality around it. There's more purpose around it. And I think that that is experienced in the same way in the professional setting. What is most important? What are those things that are priority? How do you, as a leader, and I happen to lead a very large national organization, how do I show up as a leader, not only being transparent, but also prioritizing what's most relevant, what's most critical, without also then overwhelming, and being mindful of the fact that I, along with my 100 plus employees, have a life now that has merged with work and home life, and being transparent, being empathetic, embodying the spirit of being self-aware, being cognizant that challenges for everyone is different. I think one of the panelists spoke about earlier the losses. Many have suffered losses. So, it's really about sort of coalescing all of these things that we know are the lessons and behaviors that we need to now change going forward, and sort of throwing out the old rules. Transparency and vulnerability and empathy and, D&I, and all those things are not new. They're not new. But what we have seen and what we've experienced is that now we've got to put it into action. It can no longer just be lip service. Are we actually doing these things in our day-to-day? Whether it's a virtual connection or we're on site or in person. So all of those things, I think, sort of serve as the backdrop to that change that we're all talking about, that hope for the future that we're talking about, that mindfulness that we are speaking about in terms of let's not forget, let's take these lessons today and not revert back to some old behaviors. How do we build upon what we've learned and what we've also experienced?
Well, thank you so much, April. Thank you so much to all of you for your salient remarks. A couple of things that are coming up for me just reflecting on this real time. One is I feel like we've touched on dignity, the importance of human dignity, of equality of opportunity, and bringing intentionality into how we move forward. And I just want to thank all of you, and I think what is most impressive to me, knowing each of you individually, is not your individual accomplishments, but really your sense of service, and your sense of shared responsibility to go above and beyond, just achieving for yourself. And your servant leadership is greatly appreciated. And I think that's really, if I could take one major motif coming out of this, the reflections that we've had, it's living those values, living and activating those values in real time, and having the ability to be present and also have self-care. So for ourselves. I'd also like to thank everyone who streamed in today, the many viewers who were live streaming, and all of the partners and the WFEB Forum for hosting this conversation. We could go on for many more hours, and I know that we will between us. But I just want to thank you again for taking the time to share your insights with us, and to all of the support team for helping host this event. And with that, I think we'll close the session. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks for
so
the
much.
opportunity.
Thank you.